Hello and welcome. You're listening to the 27th episode of the Inkful podcast. Our today's guest is a historian, polyglot, and freelance writer, Artemii Migavchik. As a historian, Artemi wrote a thesis about Stalinist repressions in the Soviet Union. As a polyglot, he speaks Ukrainian, Russian, German, Dutch, and now he's also learning Lithuanian. As a writer, he writes about the contemporary realities in Russia, Ukraine, and the European Union. Join our today's conversation and listen to our discussion about the Ukrainian language, Kievan Rus, and the reasons behind the Russo-Ukrainian war from both the Western and Russian points of view. Let's get started. So, good morning, Artemi.
Good morning, Paulus.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to see you. And it's also fun to see you in a different situation than we see each other usually, because Artemi happens to be my Lithuanian student, one of my Lithuanian students. And today I have the pleasure of talking with him not about Lithuania or Lithuanian language, but about languages in general. And we have a very interesting and important topic about how languages can also be used as weapons. So most of the times we think about languages as tools of communication, but they can also be used in other ways. So Artemi, just to begin with, I would like to ask you, why did you even start learning Lithuanian, and what other languages do you speak?
First of all, I wanted to thank you for inviting me, Paulus, to a podcast. And yeah, we'll answer straightforward to your question. I started learning Lithuanian because I wanted to regain something what was taken from me and my family a long time ago. My great-grandparents were Lithuanians, and unfortunately, during the Soviet times, they were forcefully relocated to Siberia. And since these times, the tradition of the language within the family has been lost. So I want to, so to say, to pay a tribute to my great-grandparents, to my ancestors, and I hope to live and study in Vilnius one day. So I think it's a combination of family urge and wish, and with my practical needs, I'd say.
Cool. Very good. Very good. So you speak English. I think Russian is your native language as well. And I know that you have learned Dutch. So am I missing any other languages that you know?
Yes, my first foreign language was German, and I also speak Ukrainian language. So in total, I do speak 5 languages, and I'm not counting Lithuanian right now because I'm still in the process of studying. I guess I can say very basic things, but I am still not able to lead a somewhat thoughtful conversation in the language. So at this moment, 5.
Right, right. But still, this is a very nice baggage of languages, and also very difficult in different languages. So, and you have also mentioned Ukrainian. So tell me, how did you learn that language?
One of my family parts are from Ukraine as well, so I was surrounded by the language since my childhood. For example, my aunt speaks Ukrainian, her children speak Ukrainian, and we used to grow up in the same town in Siberia. So I was immersed in Ukrainian language as well as in Russian since my early childhood. It was the second language of conversation for me within the family, and it was very, very much usual for me to hear Ukrainian language.
This is a very good question to also kind of begin our conversation, because when we look at the events the contemporary events that started in 2022, there's a common belief between many Russian speakers, those who follow the main narrative that the Russian government puts out, that Ukrainian language doesn't even exist. There's no such thing as a Ukrainian language. So being able to speak both Russian and Ukrainian, what do you make of this claim when some people say that, there's no such thing? At best, it's a dialect and, there's nothing else there.
Well, I believe that it's a common misconception and the result of a long-lasting, long-working propaganda process of othering Ukraine as a nation, not only Ukrainian language as a language, but also othering Ukrainians as the nation. For me, these are two drastically different languages with lots of similarities, but yet they are different languages. I think it's easier to begin with the similarities than with the differences, because there are less similarities than differences between these two languages. So both languages share the same origin. They've originated from the ancient Old East Slavic language, which was the spoken language in the early medieval state of the Kievan Rus. This was the basic language, so to speak, from which also not only Russian and Ukrainian, but also Belarusian language stems. And we, in Russian and as well as in Ukrainian and Belarusian language, we all are using the Cyrillic alphabet, which differs from the traditional Latin alphabet that is a standard for in Europe or in the European continent and within the European languages. Most of the cases, we do have a very similar grammatic structure, the way in which the syntaxes of the sentences is being done, or the causes, for example. We do share these things, the grammatical structure and vocabulary. Some of the words may be almost identical in both Russian and Ukrainian languages. These words are generally they are related. These are the oldest words, and they are mostly related to the everyday life, nature, or, like, for example, family. These are the main similarities that Russian and Ukrainian are having from my perspective of view, from my own personal experience. But of course, there are more differences between two languages than similarities, what I have already mentioned. And I do believe that, like, the key difference that you can point straight on is the phonology. This is the way how the languages sound. They sound different. They bear some similarities, but overall, I do compare Ukrainian language with a song. It is flowing. Like, even audially, it differs a lot from Russian language, and that could be told straightforward. Vocabulary is different a lot, even though there are lots of similar words. There are lots of differences between the vocabularies of Russian and Ukrainian language, because the latter was under a great influence of Polish language, of Tatar languages, what is very interesting, because of the Crimean Tatars and Khazars lived on the Crimean Peninsula up until today, eventually, which is also remarkable.
Yeah.
Even though the population of Crimean Tatars is quite small right now in Crimea.
Thanks to Stalin, as I remember.
Of course, Stalin and the
Yeah.
mass deportations of people. This was the second round of deportations of people in 1944, when already the main battles of the Second World War have switched to a more central to a part of the Central Europe. Grammar is a bit different, orthography is different, but yeah, I would say that the key differences are the phonology, the way that in which the words, the letters are being pronounced, right, and the influences of languages. These are the differences, and I would really say that it's a big understatement to call Ukrainian language as a dialect of Russian. This would be roughly as cocky as to claim that Belarusian language is a dialect of Russian language, or Serbian language is a dialect of Russian language. Same, right? These are different languages. These are languages that do belong to the group of Slavic languages from in the European family of languages, right? But these are different languages, and that is fixed. I don't think that there is any need to prove that with the use of academic references anymore, because it is quite self-evident.
Well, if you're a colonial power, you have another point of view, and most of the times, facts exist for colonial or imperialistic powers only for narratives. So it doesn't really matter the facts within themselves. It's as long as they fit a narrative, they suit a narrative, then they're good. If they don't suit a certain narrative, then either facts are not important or they don't even exist. They are omitted altogether. And like curiously from my own research, I don't know if it's truly factual because I have no idea how it's calculated, but I have figured out that in terms of lexical similarity, Russian and Ukrainian language has around 62% of lexical similarity, which means having equivalent words of the same origin, right? So that's kind of the brief description of lexical similarity. And 62% is not enough to call anything a dialect, you know. So
Exactly.
because then the Poles can also say that Ukrainian is a dialect of Polish because they have more lexical similarity, which is 70%. And then the Belarusians can say, well, wait, it's totally Belarusian dialect because we have 84% lexical similarity. Well, Lithuanians would have a little bit more trouble with it. But interestingly enough, some phrases that when I hear Ukrainian do sound a little bit closer to Lithuanian than some Russian phrases. And that could be a part of like having a shared history for over like, well, from the first half of the 14th century until the middle of the 17th century. So that's like over 300 years. You know, most Lithuanian, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania actually spoke the same language, which was borrowed from Kievan Rus, which are now the territories of Ukraine or Belarus, from at least the Lithuanian side, which was called Ruthenian, if I remember correctly. So it was a vernacular language of Old Church Slavonic. So it was just what people spoke, basically. It's not how it was used in, let's say, ceremonial situations. It was just like now we have the standard language, how it's used in formal situations, and we have the vernacular. It's how people actually speak the language. So most of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania actually used Ruthenian because they encountered it while they were moving south and west to the Slavic lands and assimilating them to the Grand Duchy. So maybe that can explain why, even though the Balts have a different origin of their language, they still have quite a lot of more similarities with Belarusian and Ukrainian, let's say Lithuanian, than it has with Russian. Although, like if a person listening to this podcast is a linguist, he or she will know that both Baltic and Slavic languages came from the same proto-language, which was called Proto-Balto-Slavic. So, but this language group, or this language, Balto-Slavic, splits like, well, the estimations vary, but somewhere between 2,500 and 4,000 years. So it's like a very large variety, but we can say, as as historians like to say, a long ass time ago. so
Exactly.
that's when they split, a long ass time ago. And naturally, the vocabulary is very different, let's say, in Lithuanian that it's in Russian. But the grammar structure, as you might have already encountered as a Russian and Ukrainian speaker, is quite similar. We have the same amount of cases. Some of the words, like, let's take a preposition za. Za and Lithuanian preposition uj is the same. These prepositions have the same case, they have the same purpose, but they have another word. So some of them are identical in terms of usage, some of them are not, and that's what brings me a lot of trouble when I'm trying to learn Russian. And I have been learning Russian for the past 4 years, more than 4 years. And I still haven't reached a significant level to have a conversation, just freely speaking with people. I still struggle a lot while speaking to people whose native language happens to be Russian, because sometimes some people don't know English and we have to figure out a common way of communication. They don't have to be even Russian. Like I have Kazakh neighbors, and the lady doesn't speak English yet, even though she's living abroad. And if we want to talk, we have to talk in Russian. And I'm having a hard time just because there's quite a lot of differences. And having a similar grammar helps, but doesn't help enough. Well, anyway, so that kind of gets the question of is Ukrainian and Russian the same language out of the way? We're settled. They're different languages, not dialects. The narrative that they're the same, false. Moving on. So when you think about, for example, the Lithuanian language, and you're currently learning this language, is it very hard for you to assimilate to it? Does it feel natural? Was it maybe harder for you to learn Dutch than it is learning Lithuanian? Like in terms of difficulty for you to get into the language, where do you find yourself?
Well, on a scale from 0 to 10, I would say that it's a strong 7.5 out of 10. It is quite difficult to find yourself in. You see, I do believe, as a historian, I'm always trying to learn about the language and the culture as much as I can. But the problem is the genesis of many words in Lithuanian is quite different from Russian words, right? If we will take a look at for example, if you find yourself in Vilnius on a street and you will take a look at the billboards with the advertisements, or for example, at the shops or other places, you will understand that many of the words make almost no sense for you. So, for example, let's compare a very, very primitive example, right? You have apteka in Russian, which is apotheek, pharmacy, right? Apotheek in German, apotheek in Dutch. You can see the derivatives of this word, the words in many countries. Apteka in Poland as well. Apteka in Latvia, even in Latvia, a country that has also a Baltic language, but that underwent through more of an influence from German language, or not only because of the historical reasons. Latvia, the territory of current Latvia, was a part where the Teutonian Knights, the Teutonian Order, was basing, so to speak, but also because of the religion, because Latvia is predominantly evangelistic Lutheran country. Is Lutheran. So
that's true.
These differences could be told. But for example, in Russian it's apteka and Lithuanian it's vaistina. Like
where's the commonality?
Where is the commonality? And I can say numerous examples about that. Like, and this is a bit difficult. So when you cannot guess an origin of a word, this is where the stuff gets hard. And you understand that, I cannot play a guess game right now. I have to eventually to enrich my vocabulary, and I think this is a difficult part for me. The other side of a coin, so to speak, is that Lithuanian bears a very similar grammatic structure with Russian, which helps a lot.
Exactly.
A lot. The way in which we are using the commas, for example, more than understandable. Grammatic structure of a sentence, more than understandable. Causes, with the exception of just one, the vocative cause, the rest are the same.
Yes.
And also the prepositions. You have given a perfect example of particles as well, for example, that are is, ish, za, ush, and so on and so forth. So in these things, I would say that learning Lithuanian from the perspective of grammar is far easier than from the perspective of vocabulary. That's my experience. While with the other languages, I had directly opposite thing. The vocabulary was quite easy to get, but the grammar was very hard. I mentioned that my first foreign language is German, right? That helped me a lot with studying Dutch. So when I started learning Dutch, when I came here in 2021 in the Netherlands, before the war, a year before the war, I learned Dutch very, very fast. I've never went to any courses, any schools in Dutch. I've never had a tutor in Dutch either. I just started studying and working in the Netherlands, and that's it. I worked for 2 years in a restaurant, so this is a very fast-paced job where you have to speak. You have to speak a lot, not only with your team but also with the customers. And this is actually this is also a big, significant, huge part of your work. people still come to a restaurant to get some experience, right? Person to person experience, I mean. And that's why I picked up Dutch pretty fast. And when I heard an unknown word for me, I could have guessed what it means because I know German.
Yeah, you filled in the gaps.
I filled in the gaps. And if I don't understand what is the origin I'm trying to guess, what could be situated in between English, German, and Frisk, the Frisian language.
Yeah.
And that turned out to be quite easy. Now I'm preparing to pass my NT2 examen. This is like the B2 level exam in Dutch, the last step of getting getting a mastery in Dutch language, with the exception of C1 exam, but it's almost impossible to pass it. I mean, not to pass it, but to register for it. It's almost impossible because it takes place once a year in May, and it is being conducted by a Dutch Belgian institution. So it is almost impossible to do, but I hope that once I will get to it as well.
This idea that I had a long time ago is that I think it would be amazing to learn a language from every major language group, because if you know, let's say, one language, like let's say, take for example Polish or Russian, so one major Slavic language, when you will go to other Slavic countries, you will not understand everything, but you might understand the main idea of what's going on around you. And of course, languages differ one from another, but the commonality between them lets you at least to get the main idea. And it seems like it's the same with when you learn German or English. For example, I'm learning Portuguese right now, and there are so many words that are similar to English. And also the grammar is so similar in some ways that it helps a lot. And it seems like it was your experience with when you were speaking about Dutch and German, because knowing one major language helps you to kind of really assimilate the other language really quickly, which is amazing. And I think it's close to a superpower that you might have. And that might be one of the reasons why many polyglots, when they learn one language, that's why they are able to have the snowball effect of learning other languages quickly. So let's say you learn French or Italian or whatever, one of the Romanic languages, and then suddenly you can pick up Spanish, Portuguese much quicker than a person who would learn it if he hadn't known one of these languages. So it's very cool. And unfortunately, when you learn Lithuanian, it only helps if you're a Latvian speaker. And those two languages, let's be honest, not many people come from Latvia or Lithuania. Like, if we sum up the two countries with all the immigrants living abroad, we might get 6 million or 7 million speakers of these two languages. So that's a little bit problematic. And your experience, what you have said, really resonates with the experience that another guest, which is also a Lithuanian teacher, she was on the show twice. Her name is Dovile. And she said that her boyfriend learned Lithuanian to a good level in 3 months because he's a Latvian speaker, and they were speaking at home. So he kind of really quickly picked it up. But she's learning Estonian at the moment. And for her, it feels like the words, fell from the sky. They're like, she cannot make any associations because the origin of the vocabulary they're not Baltic, it's Finno-Ugric, right? So that's like one misconception that people have about Estonia, because most people think, it's a Baltic country. Like, we have Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, so it must be a Baltic language. And that is not the case. It's a different language group. It's not even Indo-European, right? It's absolutely from a different origin points, so to say. And I know that some of your family members, I don't remember who exactly, did speak a Finno-Ugric language. You have told me something about that. So who was it, and which language did he or she speak?
Well, the thing is, this was my great-grandmother from mother's side. Yeah, that's the mother of my grandmother from my mom's side. Triple mother. I'm sorry for this tautology, but these are the family connections that I have to explain that, right? They are Udmurt people. The Udmurts are the Finnish-Ugric people who are living a bit up north from Tatarstan, from the Tatarstan region of Russia, inhabited predominantly by Tatars, a Tatar-speaking people,
Hmm.
ethnic
Hmm.
group, and pretty much close to the Ural Mountains. They basically used to live on the shores of Kama and Kama River, and next to Volga River, obviously. Udmurt language is a language of the Finnish-Ugric group, but unfortunately, we've also lost the Udmurt language within our family. It all began with my grandmother, my mother's mom, when she, as a schoolgirl back in 1950s during the Soviet times, told her parents that it's not cool to speak Udmurt language. If I would be speaking Udmurt language, then I would be speaking a peasant tongue, as she claimed. So she didn't even manage to learn Udmurt language, and in the entirety of her life, she spoke only Russian. What I find pretty much sad, because speaking Finnish-Ugric language is a very rare ability to have, and it's also a very interesting, different language group. And for me, as a wannabe polyglot, that would have been so interesting to be able to, at the very least, have a common understanding of what Udmurt language is, and to know some basic words and to be able to build basic sentences with the language. But unfortunately, the ability within our family to speak Udmurt is lost forever. So it's only possible if I would once, for my own interest and for the sake of linguistic experiment, I will try to learn Udmurt language. But unfortunately, we don't speak any Udmurt language anymore, and this is also the case for most of my relatives who are still living there.
So, why did that happen? Because we know that, let's say, for example, the Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation, those are huge territories. There are so many ethnicities living in either of these mentioned territories, which kind of are the same place but with a different name throughout history. And so, why was the language, let's say, your great grandmother's language, denied, or why was it restricted? Because Lithuanian had a similar history, and I think many other languages had as well. So I'm curious to hear about your great grandmother's tongue.
I think in general the problem lies deep in the in the policies and the processes of Russification that was set in the Soviet Union in late 1920s, early 1930s. I believe that this is a deep-rooted, even though this is the, so to speak, the top level of the problem, right? The most recent one, so to speak. The problem of forceful Russification lies very, very much deeper, and it spans for a considerably longer time for many peoples, for many ethnicities that used to live or are currently living on on the territory of Russia or former Soviet Union or of a former Russian Empire, and that is problematic. So the Soviet government, what is obvious, implemented Russification policies promoting Russian over any other languages within its territories. This involved the suppression of use of the language of the local languages in education, in administration, in public life, aiming to unify the diverse population under Russian language and pretty much culture. Because the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic was dominant within the Soviet Union, and the policy of Russification was carried out not only because of the common convenience, so to speak, to make Russian as lingua franca of the newly created Soviet Empire, right? Because Soviet Union is an intrinsically imperial project as well as the Russian Empire was before. But also it aimed to bolster and shape the Soviet identity that would be a supranational identity, so to speak, the one that would be standing above even quasi-national identity, right? It's like a
Mhm.
quasi-imperial national identity. That would be a very
Yeah.
proper way to formulate that, to encapsulate this, right? because it's not a nation identity per se, right? But still, it's the identity that would be assigned to all of the peoples living in this exact imperial project, regardless of their ethnic origin. And I think this was the core reason why the process of Russification went, and consequently why people like my family have forgotten or refused to go on with their languages, with their native languages, in which they've been speaking throughout most of their lives. And but at the same time, right? Just as a note, as a side note, my mother's father is Ukrainian from Vinnytsia, like from the Vinnytsia Oblast in Ukraine, and we've perfectly spoken Ukrainian.
Right.
They've managed to retain Ukrainian language. My father's father, so my grandmother is Lithuanian, and my grandfather is Ukrainian from my father's side, right? He is
Yeah.
from Ivano-Frankivsk. That's the Western Ukraine. We also spoke Ukrainian pretty much perfect, even though the Lithuanian language was forgotten. There was Udmurt language was forgotten, right? So in some of the
Right.
cases, some languages persisted while the other languages disappeared within the families, and it happened to be that a big diaspora, big group of people who were speaking the same language has always been surrounding them, because obviously Ukrainians is a very big ethnic group. In both in modern Russian as well in the Soviet Union, they were everywhere. So it wasn't it wasn't that uncommon to see a fellow Ukrainian person and to to push yourself straight forward and start negotiation in Ukrainian. That was pretty much the case. So eventually, Ukrainian language we've managed to retain it, and we do still speak it, regardless of all of the events that are happening today, from all of the problems. We still have the contacts with the family members on the other side in Ukraine, and we've managed to save it. But unfortunately, the other languages it wasn't that easy to save them, especially the languages that were less popular, so to speak, if I can say that, or the languages that were spoken by the ethnic minorities that were minorities in the broader sense of the term.
Well, I guess also geography plays a part here. And so countries that were closer to the periphery seems to be like, let's say Lithuania was on the periphery of the Russian Empire, at least. So we had a chance to smuggle books in Lithuanian from other countries. So, like from the region that is now Kaliningrad, from other countries that were not parts of the Russian Empire. So even though the language was banned from 1864 to 1918 and then restricted further by Lenin's and Stalin's years, we still managed to kind of retain the language through literature, and it was spoken and it was read. Uh, just, no one tried to say that it was being done because you can get prosecuted or sent out to somewhere where you don't want to go, right? Like
Yeah.
that was a big issue. Like just for speaking your native language, you can go to the gulag, or many bad things can happen to you, and you don't want that. But still, it kind of helped, I guess, to keep the language alive. And maybe it was something similar with Ukraine, but maybe Ukraine had another issue, or not issue. Maybe there was another situation because Lithuania is a small country with not many people. So smuggling literature, smuggling books helped us. Ukraine, on the other hand, is much larger. It's a much larger ethnic group. And there were just many more people who spoke Ukrainian. So to eradicate the language was harder than, let's say, with some smaller communities that were incorporated into the Russian Empire in one. So I think like West Bank. Okay, this is very complicated. So you have to, as I heard from Timothy Snyder, when you speak about East Bank Ukraine and West Bank Ukraine, you have to think as a river. Then in that case, East Bank was given to Russia in, I think, like the middle of the 17th century, after a treaty that I don't remember the name. I think it was 1648. It got incorporated into Russia from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, while the West Bank remained in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So that there was a split by the Dnipro River, and then then the divisions came, like 1795 marked the ending of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In general, it got divided between Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and it ceased to exist. But it's one thing is like when it ceases to exist on the map, and another thing is when it continues to exist in people's minds. And I think that's what's harder to eradicate. So that's a common thread. Well, anyways, so let's think a little bit about the word Russia in general, because this is a very interesting word and very misunderstood in many ways. So what is the origin of the word Russian? And you have Prussian, you have Russian, you have Belarusian, you have Kievan Rus. There's like many Rus in it. So how did Russia become Russia? Because we know that until it got called the Russian Empire, mainly the lands were called Muscowy, or the Great Duchy of Moscow. That's how it was called. But in 1721, I believe, it suddenly changed from the Grand Duchy of Muscovy into the Russian Empire. So how did Russia become Russia, and why? What do you think?
In my opinion, we have to understand that prior to the emergence of the concept of Russia, right, as a big country, and what is commonly and colloquially associated with Russia in the mind of every single person, we have to begin with the Kievan Rus. Kievan Rus was the ancient state of Eastern Slavic tribes united by the northern peoples, by the Vikings, as it is commonly called, or to be quite exact, by the Varangians, Varyagi. Mm-hmm. These guys were notorious for being keen traders and quite fierce fighters. So the people of Norse, basically, right? This is what we have in our imagination, the Norsemen.
Bearded guys with axes.
Yeah, bearded, strong, swollen guys in the helmets with axes and stuff. Yeah, it is quite so. Unfortunately, among the Eastern Slavic tribes, there were approximately 20 of them, to be quite exact, right? Among the Ents, Drevlyans, Dregovichi, Krivichi. Funny fact, in Latvian language, Russia is Krivia and Russians are Krivs, because of the Krivichi as the tribe.
Oh wow!
So it's a bit of some interesting facts. Yeah, a side note.
Cool.
Among all of the tribes like Polyani, Radimichi, and so on, there was, because of their differences, minor differences in administration, in the way of living, because some of them were the beekeepers, for example. The other ones were the hunters. Third ones were the agrarians, right? They had all of these minor differences between themselves that resulted into the inability to reach any kind of agreement upon who would be the head tribe of us all. Who would be the head Slav, the master Slav, so to speak, right? In this case, this was settled quite easy, according to the most widespread theory about the emergence of the Kievan Rus, about the emergence of the first single Slavic state. The Slavs called whom they basically knew. They knew Varangians, the Norsemen, basically. They knew them because they're the main trade route from the Baltic to Byzantine happened to go mostly through the East Slavic tribes' lands. This route was called Izvaryak v Greki in Russian language. We know it as this, if roughly translated, from the Varangians to the Greeks. So this was a major trade route back then, back in the days. And the Slavs knew that, these Norse people, we can do something together with them. they were united. They were quite a considerable military force back then. They were good navigators, both in sea and in the rivers. So they mastered the river and the sea navigation. And most important thing, they were able to counteract, to fight the nomadic tribes of the south that were a huge headache for the Eastern Slavs. So a combination of these factors, also with the fact that they were seen by the Eastern Slavs as some kind of impartial judges, right? They were the people from the outside who came to rule, and they were, in Russian language there is a good saying, "Ni нашим, ни вашим," when we are trying to agree on the middle grounds, right?
Gotcha.
Not to the ours, but not to you either, right? So this was the way they've tried to escape the dilemma of the problem of not being able to agree between themselves who would be the rulers, right? And this was quite a good decision. As we know today, the Kievan Rus was found that the Rurik, the first representative of the Rurik dynasty, the first ruling dynasty of the Kievan Rus and of the first single Slavic state, right? It was approximately it was particularly 800, the year 862. This date is known today because of Nestor's primary chronicles. Nestor was a monk, the Kievan monk, who lived in the city of Kiev and wrote basically the first chronicle book that was devoted to the history of the Slavs.
Right.
And this was exactly the year when the Slavs called the Varangian prince Rurik to rule over them, to bring some order and to bring the unity that they all low-key wanted, right? But they weren't able to agree. So from this point we know that some kind of state that is called Rus has emerged. But the word Russia, in the meaning that we know today, has not been actively used until 1721. This was the date when the Russian Empire was founded by Peter the Great. This was the year when the Russians, the Muscovites, but later on the Russians, won against the Swedes in the Northern War. It lasted almost 21 years, starting from late 1700 to 1721. It was a fierce war against the Swedish king, and eventually Russians have won. And considering that the Russians have received huge land concessions from the Swedes, including Finland, including parts of Poland, right, Ukraine as well. From now on, Russia is the empire, and every single empire must have a certain historical backbone, right? The
narrative.
The spine, the historical spine that would form the core of the narrative of the national creation, the myth of the national creation, right? Even though the understanding of nationalism was not in existence back then, basically. The some form of cohesion from the history and self-legitimation from history has already been taking place. And that's why the word Russia was created and used. Россия, Российская империя, Russian Empire, was used by Tsar Peter the Great.
And it's actually, you don't need to reach the age of nationalism to understand that it's easy to conquer lands. It's hard to keep them.
Of course.
Right? So conquering is easier than keeping. And what keeps the lands? It's a narrative, that it's a story that you tell and that you force other people to believe through, well, many generations. So it was funny because, as I understand, when Kievan Rus split apart, because it was a really interesting, I wouldn't call it a nation state because nation states didn't exist, but an interesting state. Like in the 11th century, it had free education, not primary schools, but it had schools for education that was free for people, at least from what I have heard. Like that was not a common thing in other areas in Europe even as well. Like that was years before this kind of thing appeared in Europe in general. So it was really ahead of its time in certain manners. And it fell apart due to, well, the Mongols. That's what I understand. It was pressure from the east mainly, and also not just the pressure of the east. Before that, it was unable. So when the main person that ruled the lands died, his sons could not really reach an agreement who is going to be the next leader. I don't remember the names, but that's the story that I remember. You can tell me if it was correct. And then it kind of fell into these like little territories, these smaller kingdoms that later got conquered by the invading forces from the east. So that's the story. Common ruler, he dies. Little kingdoms, foreign invasion, incorporation. So part of the lands got incorporated by the Lithuanians because we had pressure from the west. So the Teutonic Knights kind of forced the Lithuanian tribes to assimilate. So it's a very nice story to think like, oh, the Lithuanians all came together and you said like, let's be Lithuania, the Grand Duchy. It's not really like how it happened. It seems like there was another Baltic tribe, the Prussians, who experienced a terrible fate of being exterminated by the Teutonic Knights. So the smaller tribes came together, a lot of bloodshed happened, Mindaugas became king. And then it seems like from the 14th century, Gediminas at least was moving south and north and incorporating a lot of the post-Kievan Rus lands into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Well, anyways, but there was a very common thread of whenever you conquer some of the Kievan Rus, ex-Kievan Rus lands, then you get the ability to call yourself the king of all Rus or like the leader of all Rus. So there were many people who were like the Grand Duke of Lithuania and the ruler of all Rus. And then some people, let's say later, because some people don't know that Moscow actually came into being like 300, 400, 500 years after Kiev. So it was like a little bit of an insignificant place. It was like a fort at best when the Kievan Rus fell apart. But then some things happened and it became a massive force, but 500 years later. And then people from Moscow got to call themselves as well, the leader of all Rus. so there were many of them, and it seemed like very important to actually be the ruler of all Rus. And what better way to show this point than by calling yourself Russia? Like, this is so smart. This is so intelligent. Like, you just call the country or the empire Russia, and it's automatically in the minds of everyone that you are the ruler of all Rus. And it seems like this is like one of the main narratives that is being also waged in this current war in Ukraine, because Putin is still the ruler of all Rus. De facto, he's the ruler of also Ukraine. So what do you think? What do you make of this narrative? Do you think it kind of represents accurately the events of history, or maybe I was going a little bit off the rails with my interpretation?
It is a bit, so to say, it is a bit deep, but overall, it is something like this. Imagine the situation of you trying to make a new Instagram account and witnessing, sorry, this nickname has been taken. It's been already taken. This is exactly the situation with the name of Russia. You are quite right though. If we will see at the current narrative or in the current narratives of the Russian propaganda, we will see that would be pretty much evident for us that Vladimir Putin and his regime is aiming to monopolize and privatize the use of the Kievan Rus and all of the words, basically all of the wordings related to Rus and Russia. Why it is so? Because, well, if you will take a look at the Russian constitution, I wrote about this in my thesis, then you'll see that there is a very interesting part in it, in the updated version of the constitution, for which people were, how can I say that, were
Not so
asked to,
satisfied.
not so satisfied for sure, and were asked to not to vote for, but to display their agreement with, because obviously we're talking about an authoritarian regime. To be quite exact, it's the Bonapartic type of a regime where people are being asked for, where there are no elections or no plenums or no referenda whatsoever. These are just the acclamation. This is the acclamation process. Every single electoral process in Russia is the process of acclamation. Either you agree with the following set of rules right now, with the state of things right now, or not. That's it. This is the simple question. But if you will take a look at the Article 67, paragraph 2 of the current Russian constitution, amended in 2020, you'll see this. I will quote unquote, I will just quote that. The Russian Federation, united by a 1,000-year history, preserving the memory of the ancestors who passed on to us ideals and faith in God, as well as continuity in the development of the Russian state, recognizes the historically established state unity. So they take a look at the wording that is being used here. Of course, it's a translation. It's the most direct translation into English. And if you will just slightly take a look, then then one might understand and realize that it was a quite good, stepping stone in the preparations for the all-out invasion of Ukraine. Because we have all of the points of historical statecraft here as a process, right? United by 1,000 years history, ancestors who passed on to us ideals and faith in God, talking about the Christianity in Orthodoxy, and the baptizing of the Rus by the Duke Vladimir.
Yeah.
So continuity in the development of the Russian state and historically established state unity. If you will take a look at 4 of these discursive markers, then it becomes quite clear that we now understand how the monopolization of this overall Rus narrative and we are the ancestors of the great Kievan Rus works. There's basically a discursive manner to reinforce or to reshape the national identity that is not even existing right now.
Well, it's an attempt to create it, though.
It's an attempt to create it, but it's very difficult because Russia as a country has never existed apart from some kind of an imperial project, apart from some kind of, superstructure, imperial superstructure that is above the Russians all the time. They have never existed apart from that, right? Because even though the Russian Federation is called after Russia, and the Russians are the primary ethnic group, the first ethnic group in the country, it's still inhabited by 200 plus ethnic groups, more than 200 ethnic groups in Russia. Ethnicities, excuse me about that. More than 200 ethnicities in Russia. It is unthinkable. It is a big, diverse, multi-ethnic and multinational country. It is just insane how diverse it is. And yet the current regime tries to elaborate on the achievements of past and the basis of the unity of the Slavs. It is very remarkable and recognizable that the current Russian regime aims to regain the unity of the 3 Slavic peoples, the 3 biggest East Slavic nations, the Russians, the Ukrainians, and the Belarusians. Because if we will go a bit further to 2021, a year later after the amendments were introduced and accepted in the Russian Federation, we will see that Vladimir Putin has published his notoriously known essay on the historical unity of Russians, Ukrainians, and the Belarusians. A very A very hard thing to read for for people who are interested in history or know more a bit more than what is being delivered via the television in the Russian Federation. But still, it is a very remarkable document from the perspective of a discursive propaganda and from the narrative creation that Russia is continuously trying to develop. This attempt to use historical statecraft and the past to maintain the present with no picture of future. It is particularly interesting because if we'll refer to Benedict Anderson, to a person who contributed a lot to our understanding of what the nation is and how nationalism works as a process. I will quote him as far as I remember, that the nation is an entity that marches from the past to an unknown future. And today, if we will take a look at Russia, it is the nation that lives and stems out from the past just to justify its present, but not future. There is no picture of any future, mm, any progress in what Russian propaganda and Russian narratives are trying to offer its own citizens and to the world itself. What is not only particularly interesting for me because of my focus, my academic focus on this issue, but also particularly interesting as a case. I think Russia. I will quote Jake McGlynn here, a very renowned researcher on the memory politics and the use of history by Russia as a mean of propaganda. It is a particularly interesting concept that Russia is using history so actively to the extent that that could be a very radical example of historical statecraft in the world in which we live today. Well, of course, we have many countries who are trying to use history as the context in which they live today, right? As the basis for their identity, of their national identity. Lithuanians are not the exception. Latvians are
Yeah,
not the exception.
for sure.
Most of the countries are not the exception, basically, because we are still living in the era of nationalism. But if we'll take a closer look at what Russia does right now, it is a very exaggerated and radical example of the usage of history to build up something.
Well, and again, it's not the facts that matter. Again, it's the facts that fit a narrative. So facts can be changed and molded as long as they fit a narrative. So in this idea, it seems like the narrative comes first and then the facts come second, or their interpretation comes second. So, like, I will find ways to reaffirm my bias through examples. So it's kind of like a confirmation bias in a way. So I will find the right facts to make this narrative seem plausible. And again, it's not only the Russians that do it. You know, they're doing it very actively now to wage a war. Other countries do that to reaffirm their identity, to kind of keep the status quo, right? So not to break apart and so on. So that's a very interesting situation here. Well, anyways, sorry for interrupting. Would you like to add something to that point before we move to another one?
No, it's all right. I think I've elaborated quite enough, so we can move to the next point or question.
Very good, very good. Well, anyway, like this seems to be like the main idea of our today's conversation, you know, to speak about what's happening now and how is it even possible that this could be happening. When you think about, let's say, even this paper written by Putin, this article called On the Historical Unity of the Slavic Nations, East Slavic Nations. If you say it's on something, it means it already exists, right? So that's already implied in the language being used. So that's also quite smart trick there. But anyway, why do you think, like, let's take, for example, maybe that's the last question. Certain countries who had been empires before are no longer continuing their imperialistic ways. So let's take, for example, Poland, right? Poland has, this might seem odd from a Lithuanian, But in this situation, it has all the rights to make a claim on Vilnius, right? If they wanted to. They can say, we had Vilnius before and we want it back. And they could have done it in the 1990 as well. They could have said like, well, we had Vilnius before. It used to be part of our lands. We want it back. Or Lviv. Like Lviv has been a Poland territory for ages. Lviv is Poland. But what they chose to do is say, okay, let's put a blue and yellow flag on top of Lviv. Lviv is Ukraine. Vilnius is Lithuania. You have the right to self-determination. We have no claims to the past. We want to look to the future. Which was a smart move because most likely they understood if there's a national Lithuania and national Ukraine, it will be good to have some buffer space against the not so national Russia. So my question, the last question here is, what do you think? Why have certain countries given up on their imperialistic dreams and demands while certain countries continue to live?
It's a very complicated question, I have to admit, because the reasons for such an aggressive imperialistic behaviors are very unique and very different from point to point. You see, for example, if we will take a look at the other examples of like an aggressive behavior of today, right? Well, we will always be thinking about Iran, North Korea, right? But they don't have any imperial attitudes. They simply don't. For North Korea, threatening the rest of the world with nuclear weapons, predominantly South Korea and the US, is just a mean for survival in a way. Because I will elaborate a bit on this because it's my high school interest, North Korea and Northern Korean diplomacy. It's a very interesting topic, to be exact. You see, for North Korea, it has always been very typical and usual to maneuver between Soviet Union, China, South Korea, Japan, and the US. What basically North Korea does is a very skillful diplomacy of manipulating all the sides. And it is a very special regime. It's a nationalist socialist regime with the dynastic rule. So in order to stay in power and in order to, well, for the Kim dynasty, and I will call them dynasty pretty much unironically, in order for them to keep their grip on power in North Korea, they just have to, do a couple of nuclear tests or to swag around with their artillery, just to get some of these humanitarian aid and finance tranches, just to continue living, just to go on, just to let their citizens, the citizens of North Korea, to live and not to starve and die. What has already happened sometimes in the Northern Korean history. Unfortunately, in the years of 1990, especially when the Soviet Union has collapsed. And so we will see that threatening and this behavior is a mean of survival for these regimes. Same applies to Iran, same applies to Russia. So Russia, it just has happened to be like this, that the way of Russia's behavior is inherently imperialistic, because it has always been conquering those who are weaker around it. If you will take a look at the history, right? The starting from Yermak's exploration of Siberia, conquering the tribes of Finnish Ugric tribes, or the steppe tribes. That was simply the way to behave, the way to expand, the way to. You see, it's also very particular for Russian history that it has always had an extractive economy, right? The one that was not being built and living by the innovations, by technical progress whatsoever, but in most cases just by extracting some natural resources, furs, right, beeswax, Of course, slaves, for a very considerably long period of time, Russia has survived because it has been selling its people basically abroad as slaves. What I find absolutely disgusting.
Prolonged serfdom.
Yeah, a prolonged
Yeah.
serfdom, and I would say an unescapable serfdom. Eventually a very long tradition of serfdom that was abolished only in 1861 by Alexander II. And even though it was abolished on paper, it was very hard for a serf to eventually drop the chains, to get unchained, get its own land, and become free in economic sense either as well. So if you will take a look why some countries do behave like Russia, then you understand that it's mean for survival, but not for survival of the country, but those who are ruling the country. It is the eternal war. The way of behavior, the strategy of threatening is just a mere way to survive. But in the case of Russia, it's also a particularly dear and yet hard process of and even an attempt to create a national identity from many puzzle pieces that it has, mostly referring to history, to its imperial history, to its history of being the country that conquers the others, right? So I think this is where the root of the this behavior lies. And mostly, if you will see that aggressive behavior, with the exception of the US, that has a very exceptional position in the world, right? It is the sole superpower still at this moment, right? And if we will take a look at the 90s, it was the only country that was able to project its domestic policy into the foreign policy, right? Into the global politics. It was the only country back then, after the Soviet Union has collapsed, that was able to do so and do it successfully eventually. The Gulf War, the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, the counter-terrorist operation of the joint NATO forces in Afghanistan that started in 2001 and ended in 2021, for that lasted for 20 years. This was unprecedented. But with such an exception, the rest of the countries, they are not aiming to the I mean, I'm talking about the free, the so-called democratic world, right? Even though
Yeah.
democracy is a very even a pejorative term today, right? Because not that many people can define what a democracy is today. But yeah, if we will take a look, this behavior is typical for authoritarian regimes that are lacking either domestic appreciation and domestic support, or they're lacking national identity, or altogether.
Well, when you mentioned the US, it's like I cannot how to say not touch upon the subject because um, well, whenever you get to speak to a Russian who has an imperialistic mindset, who has his own beliefs of what Russia is and what it should be, whenever you ask the question, why has Russia invaded Ukraine? One of the questions that you will get asked back, well, why did the US invade Afghanistan or whatever? And it's like, it's the othering of the actions all the time. You can never get a direct answer without hearing something about the US. It's like, even when you think about Maidan, let's say the revolution in Maidan Square in
The
2014.
dignity revolution in Ukraine, right? Yep.
Yeah. And when it started, from what I know at least, it was just students protesting because the president of that time said, we will not join the European Union, but we'll sign an association paper, which could bring Ukraine closer to joining the European Union in a way. And it was already like, for some young people, like our age people and younger people, it was like a window to opportunities of maybe studying with Erasmus programs, having a future in Europe. It was like a window to the West in a way, a small one, but still a window. And when during the last day, by the way, this paper had to be signed in Vilnius. So funny enough. But during the last moments, the president, that time the president of Ukraine, I don't remember his surname.
Yanukovych,
He
yes.
said like Yanukovych, that's the one. He decided like, no, I'll not sign it. And many people were appalled by that. And students, young people, decided to go to the square of Maidan and to protest. Basically, it was a peaceful protest. That like most of the time, it was less than 1,000 people in the square. It was cold. It was November, but people wanted to, show their young people wanted to show that they don't agree with this decision. And on the ninth day, Yanukovych decided to call in the police and beat up some of the protesters. So it was the first time, it seems like in Ukrainian history after 1991, it was one of the first times that violence was used on peaceful protesters. And what happened after that? Well, their parents, many other people joined the protest, and it was not just about this, it was actually about political reasons, like we will not allow force to be used on our children, and this ruling regime has to change. So it ended up being hundreds of thousands of people on the streets and not like less than 1,000, and it lasted for a long time. But how the Russian media portrayed it, that it was which is always funny, it was a CIA operation happening.
Of course.
Because of course, the Americans has to have instigated this, because why else should Ukraine look into the West when they have the beautiful East? Like we have all that you want. Like why are you trying to determine your own future, right? In a way, why are you like, you have no right to do it in certain ways. That was the idea. And even that, it was portrayed in different ways. And further on, then the little green men appeared in Crimea with the message that, there you have a CIA Nazi government who is coming now to the south to eradicate the Russian population of the south. And you have to do something about that, otherwise you will all die. That was kind of the rhetoric.
That was kind of, you are quite right. Unfortunately, I have to admit that this was the case. But this narrative is very typical. I'm sorry for interrupting you, but this is like the classics, I would say. Of course, in the field of the Russian foreign policy, as the part of the IR, international relations studies, right? We have a belief. It was developed by fellow of Berkeley University today, professor of Berkeley University, Andrei Tsigankov, in 2016, that that Russia is basically creating a significant other out of the US. So for Russia, it's a role model that Russia desires to be the United States, but is inherently impossible for it to become one. It couldn't be one. It just simply couldn't be. That's why it tries to mimic it in the behavioral way, in a discursive way, but of course with some regional specifics, right? As one could joke, right? There are many similarities between Russia and the US. I've been to the US twice in my life, and I can say that for judging from my experience with Russia and the US. But it is very interesting to see in which ways these two countries are like similar and different. I would say that like Russia is the internet pirated version of original TV series that was refilmed and redubbed, so something like this. But jokes aside, yes, for Russia, US is the role model, and the fall of the Soviet Union was inexorably hard for Russians. Like it was extraordinarily a hard event, heartbreaking event, I would say even. And the fact that Russia has lost the status of a superpower is extremely painful. Yet, Russia still feels that it is in the state of a superpower, of being a superpower in the global arena. Of course, Russia is a great power out of many factors. There is a conceptualization of powers brought by Carr in 1938 and added with the superpower in the 60s. So the great power, regional power, middle power, small power, and simply and the failed states. Basically, the failed states was also introduced in the 90s as a term into the IR, I guess. So, it's not that like what Russia does is great, but it's a great power if from the perspective of international relations as a science. From the classification, it has an enormous amount of nukes. It has very questionable, very corrupted, but yet a big army. It has quite some economic possibilities, even, and of course, enormous natural resources. And an enormous territory as well.
Yeah.
So, from all the sides, it is a great power. Yet, it is not a superpower anymore, because it's not a confederation. Because what Soviet Union was, it was technically a confederation of 15 separate states, right? So it is not one already. And Russia can technically even be someone who can challenge the United States. If you think about like any, of course, I believe that the war that is happening now is impossible because we have so close cultural ties between Russia and Ukraine, right? On an interpersonal level, because I was thinking as a person, not as a scientist, right? But if you will take a look in the retrospective, it is easy to be wise after the event, of course. But if you will take a look at the events from a retrospective, right? Then it was perfectly clean. It was perfectly clear. Everything went to this. Every single detail went to this. And of course, this is what Russia is trying to do now. It tries to behave itself as if it is the Soviet Union, yet not being one.
So, Artemii, okay, I promised that it was the last question. That was the last question. So let's take the example that the Allied Western forces let Russia win, because that's the only probability that it might happen, is that actually the Western governments stop supporting weapons to Ukraine, stop supporting Ukraine economically, and just say, okay, let's give it to Russia. So it's like we're playing chess, we're sacrificing a pawn. Because that's what it is, honestly. They don't want to give enough weapons to Ukraine because they fear the fall of the Russian Federation. Just like the US feared the fall of the Soviet Union, they were actually doing everything that they could, in a way, to keep it together. And like they were surprised when, let's say, the Baltic nations said, like, nope, that's it. We're opting out. And it's like, what the heck is happening? So they were actually unprepared for this. And as it sounds like very counterintuitive, like from many people's point of view, yes, of course, the US wanted the Soviet Union to fall, but it was not the plan. And it seems like it's not the plan to actually, because it would cause too much chaos and havoc internationally, at least in the mind of the Allied West, if Russian Federation would, go into internal chaos like it did in the 1940 or like after that. So, but what would happen, let's say, if Ukraine falls, it gets added to the Russian Federation territories? What's next?
A very, very difficult question because I'm a historian. I'm not a futurologist, or something. I don't believe like futurologist is of course a fake thing. I'm sorry for my language, but it's like non-existing thing. But if we will think about the perspectives of the grimmest, the darkest scenario of the West, basically leaving Ukraine alone and letting Russia to capture it, just imagine how big and how hard would be the administrative, economic, and financial, and also political issues, how hard they will be within the newly united Russia with Ukraine as its part. Ukraine is the largest part, is one of the largest countries in Europe, right? It's a very big country. The front line right now is approximately 1.7 thousand kilometers, just the front line, the active one, right? And just imagine how big is this country. It would the If Russia will just take Ukraine and forcefully join it to its territory, to its state, right? It will cause an unprecedented chaos. It will be very, very hard for Russia. It will be like Russia as a country would be submerged into the myriad of issues and problems that the this new territorial expansion would cause. It would be the hugest, the biggest, the ginormous headache for all of the branches of Russian government and power. This would be insane. This would be insanely hard. Just consider that, like, Ukraine is. Just think about the size of Ukraine. Think about the population. How hard that would be to retain a nation of, like, okay, right now it could be even 30 million people, considering the migration, the death toll, whatsoever. Right? It could be a nation of 30 million. But just consider that it is one fifth of Russian current population, like roughly one fifth. It is insane. It is just it is inhumanly insane. Take a look at what is happening in Moscow Oblast, in the region that surrounds the capital of Russia. The situation with the civic infrastructure is so goddamn bad there that the pipes are because so many buildings, like so many apartment blocks are being built, whatever. Yet the infrastructure is still being the Soviet one, the old one that was projected, whose capacity was projected for far less population, far less objects, and far less buildings back then, right? Imagine that Russians cannot do anything with that in the region that surrounds Moscow. That's 25 kilometers from Moscow. That is insane. And you're talking about joining one of the biggest countries in Europe, if not the biggest territory-wise after Russia. It is insane.
What do you think? So is the goal to, instead of doing that, to put a puppet regime? Was that the intended goal all along?
Initially, yes, but now I think this war is going on just for the sake of moving on. The war allows Putin to stay in power. In other words, why did so Medvedchuk, Viktor Medvedchuk, right? The cum Putin. Cum is, I don't know how to translate this degree of kinship, because we have a very broad vocabulary for the kinship denomination in Russian language. But
right.
That's basically a person who baptized the daughter of Putin, right? This is cum.
Okay.
This is the godfather,
okay.
the godfather of Putin's daughter. And
right.
And why did the Russians had such a wide and big overreaching influence in Ukraine even after 2014? Because of course they wanted to install a kind of a puppet regime. The intention was not to occupy the whole country. It is if you will see what is happening at the battlefield right now, this is the only outcome that could be, because there is nothing to occupy now. It's basically the moon scenery, the moon landscape that wants for flourishing small, nice, and neat cities.
So it has no future at the moment. It's just a means for legitimating Putin's position. So that's why it's going on in certain ways. Because if, let's say, Putin takes out the soldiers out of Ukraine, that would be, in a way, in his mind, the end of his regime. Is that kind of what you were alluding to?
Exactly, I believe so. I'm strongly, I'm really assured about that, because according to Putin and according to the Russian state officials, it is approximately 600,000 Russian military personnel involved right now at this very moment, at the minute we are talking, in the war with Ukraine. Imagine all of these people coming back into Russia. with the PTSD, for example, with the overreaching availability of weaponry, of assault rifles, guns like handguns, hand grenades, whatever. Imagine what will happen. Right now, on Saturdays, next to the grave of the unknown soldier in the Alexandrovsky Sad, in the garden of the Alexander in the city center of Moscow, under the walls of Kremlin, from now on, every Saturday, the wives of the mobilized men are protesting in the white headscarves, bringing the flowers to the grave of the of an unknown soldier as the symbol of protest against what is happening. Because these people, the mobilized people, are already 1.5 years at the front line if they are not dead, right? Those who are yet alive. They are basically trapped in the war, and if all of them will come back into Russia at a single moment, this will be insane. That would be the chaos. That's why there is no way back for the regime if it wants to survive. It will prolong the war by any possible and foreseeable means. And also, it lies deep down in the psychology of a regime because partly the way of thinking of this regime is being based on the jail culture in Russia. It's a very, very deep topic for a talk that could be 2 hours long talk, and I will not cover even half of the issues connected with that. But I will just elaborate a bit over that. It is considered not right for the real men, I will say it with the strong Russian accent, to
With a strong
go
R.
to turn their backs to strong men. It is not the way of behavior for the real men to turn their back, to go back, you know. Это не по-пацански отступать, to retreat. It's not the right thing for a real man to retreat. And this embeds so deep in the psychology of the current rulers of Russia that they will just go on for the sake of staying in power and going on. That's it.
So maybe then let's finish up with the our possible interpretation of, we understand why Russia is not stopping the war, even though it's a stalemate and they are losing a lot of resources, a lot of manpower. But historically, it doesn't seem like the wars that Russia or Soviet Union has fought really cared about the amount of people dying. Like at least my history teacher used to have a joke that during the Second World War, when 10 Russian soldiers march to attack, only 9 of them shout and only 1 has a gun. So this is like the parody, at least, of the situation. So they are ill-equipped and they're like, well, meat in certain ways. It seems like it was also the situation with some of the mobilized soldiers that were also captured. So that didn't change much. But what I wanted to say, that we do understand from this point why Russia is not ending the war. Why do you think the West is not helping the Ukraine to push out the soldiers away from the territory? Is it really because it doesn't have the means to support, or is it because they don't want that to happen for certain reasons? My interpretation is the fear of chaos if Russian Federation would go into civil war or like fall apart. But this is like just a convenient way for me to explain this situation because I don't understand it otherwise. Like, I have no idea. Is it profitable for both sides? Let's say for the supporting EU and NATO. Let's take, for example, just EU and Americans, because they're supporting the Ukrainian cause with money. Is it financially profitable for them to do that in some ways? And that is why, like, I don't know. I have my ideas, but it's just because of the ignorance. Like, I cannot comprehend why. Why do you think that might be the case?
The support of Ukraine for Europe, for example, is deeply problematic and is very complicated. It is it is a hard weight that is being put on the shoulders of Europe, basically. So I wouldn't say that Europe is really benefiting from any side of the war. Starting from the inability to get cheap primary goods from Russia. I mean, oil, gas, like iron ore, whatever you name it, ending up with the need to spend more and more and more of their money on the rearmament, because like since the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, basically the European generals were the generals, the chiefs of staff, they were largely forgotten people. They were sitting in their military bases doing almost nothing, not even remotely receiving the finances that they got in 70s and the 80s, for example, right? Um, for Europe, it is deeply problematic. It is strictly a political decision to support Ukraine. While for the US, we will analyze the involvement of the US in any war or when the conflict anywhere in the world is happening, we'll see that the American military production complex benefits a lot from what is happening. Because the US is a remote country that is being situated across the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean, if we will take from the other side of the world, right? It is a remote place that is being able to produce lots of armaments, profit from that, and it has such an absolutely unthinkably huge military budget of almost 3 trillion USD. It's like two Russia's GDPs annual.
Yeah.
It's like it's only for military. It's the military budget of the United States. That 4% of this budget that is being sent as a help to Ukraine is nothing. Is absolutely nothing for them, because they profit more. This war enables Europeans to order more weaponry from the US. Because what they have now, the Europeans as well as the Americans, they send to Ukraine. They are rearming themselves, putting orders to the US, because the domestic military production complex in Europe is not as strong as in the US, of course. The Americans are profiting by getting the money, getting the orders, offering more labor places for its own people who are involved in the military production complex. And overall, it is a big political thing for them to support Ukraine. It's a plus for their image as the country who defends liberal democratic values all around the world.
Although if you are a Democrat, that might be the case. But if you're a Republican, it seems that nowadays it's no longer the case. It seems that the idea of withdrawing the support and investing it into the US would, at least it's more appealing to a certain population. So it's like a populistic tool, so to say. So, but it seems that, yeah, they benefit from it. And would you say that that is the reason why the US and, well, the other allies, but mainly US, sends equipment but not enough? So in order to prolong the conflict, could that be one of the intentions, to make it longer so you can benefit more from it? It's only our interpretation. I'm not saying that is the reality, but let's just hypothetically think about it. Could it be one of the reasons why, okay, so there is support, but a limited amount of it?
Well, that could be one of the reasons, as well as the earlier mentioned reason by you, that like the collapse of Russia, the possibility of a civil war will create a huge instability in the region and could cause a great global instability. So I think it's a myriad of reasons that could be taken into account, but I do believe that financial reason of prolonging the war is strictly on point, on spot, cynical, right? I will not deny that it exists, and we know that the lobbying power of the military production complexes in the United States is very strong. The Vietnam War has eventually happened because of the lobbying power of Ford, of whose general director, whose CEO if we will use the modern word, was Robert McNamara, a person who was the member of Joint Chiefs of Staff when the decision of the invasion of Vietnam was taken, and at these times, right? So if we will think about this, yes, that could be one of the reasons. But I believe that that could sound very, very, very radical or very, I would say, very superficial, right? Superficial, I guess. But I believe that
It can be a parts of it, but not the totality.
of course, definitely not. It could be just a part of it. But also, I believe that another part of the question is that it is strictly unreasonable to absolutely destroy Russia as a country, because we will just consider the upcoming rivalry between the US and China, right? Uh, Letting Russia into the hands of China is possibly a nightmare scenario for the United States, because Russia is already like literally giving away, making it rain its natural gas and oil to China, selling it cheaper than to Russian citizens, basically. Because when I asked my acquaintances, friends who have the individual houses in Russia, they pay more for the gas per month than it is being sold to China via the pipelines. It is not normal. It is not normal. So I believe that could be also the case. But again, this is my interpretation. I still cannot understand why this war is happening in the heaven. I understand why this is happening from the side of Russia, but I cannot really delve into the reasoning of the Western allies, because, for example, for Europeans, it's a big problem. It is considerably hard, and it is becoming hard. As a result, just the war in Ukraine is a part of a problem. But for example, in the Netherlands, we already have the radical right wing elected by the majority of population. Basically, people have voted most for the right wing radical party of Geert Wilders, who is considered a very, very staunch right wing person. And this is the case in the other European countries. So
Could it be that people stopped having a perspective, a wider perspective? And I don't know, like if you have ever felt this, but when so let's say I'm a guy that likes martial arts, and I trained martial arts for like since I was a kid, and I had a couple of matches. I had a kickboxing match, I had a jiu-jitsu match, and the sensation when you actually go to fight another person, if you're not used to it, you start getting tunnel vision. Like you're super honed in on the situation, but you don't hear and you don't see anything on the sides. Like you're absolutely going like this. Like if for the people who are listening to the audio, I'm showing that it's like you don't have any peripheral vision. Could it be that most nations, for one reason or the other, are losing their peripheral vision in a certain way, that they don't have a further perspective about what is happening in the areas around them, just focusing on what's happening within? Could it be like some kind of this situation, just a lack of perspective about the world in general? Because the right-wing governments are not just being a part of, like, let's say the Dutch society. They're coming up in different places around the world. It's a tendency. It's a nobody's tendency that authoritarianism is rising. It could even be after the 2024 election, even the US can be in this kind of situation if things go that way. So what's up with that? Like, okay, maybe let's leave it for another time. This is like too much to answer during one conversation. Like I cannot stop asking questions. Like we will go forever. Let's keep the authoritarianism rising
yes.
question, and maybe Oswald Spengler, if you're a fan of his work, we could talk about the decline of the West, whatever. But that's for round two. So anyways,
Yeah.
Artemius, thank you for joining the conversation. It was really interesting to pick your brain and to speak in English to you, because my Russian is terrible. You are only learning Lithuanian. Thank God we have a lingua franca through which we can actually communicate, and so that's good. And yeah, if there's any ending notes or like some things that are left unsaid in your mind, please go ahead and tell them. If not, well, then we'll call it quits for today and wait for the second episode.
I just wanted to thank you for inviting me. It was a great conversation from my point of view. And we have eventually found out that we have far more things to discuss. So I'm looking forward to another talk about especially about this topic. The topic of the mass rise of a right-wing populism is so on point today that I think people should be really considering it as a great problem, as well as for example, as the fundamental economic changes when our economic structure from the capital dominant structure switches to rent dominant structure, as it was during the feudal times back then, right? So I think
Yeah.
it's a great topic to discuss later on. And I'm just thanking you for such a great opportunity to have me here and to talk on the topics that I love and interested in for quite a long time. So thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Thanks, Artemis. So I'll see you in the Lithuanian lessons. And until next time, see ya.